Okay, so I'm going to reiterate the rebirth of society, which took place in the 15th century, just to start off, which was considered the second renaissance, the pandemic that has just transcribed the course of business, right? So on the global market, it's crazy to think that the gold standard and that whole currency thing and people getting along, even with language barriers, it wasn't like the problem. But let's continue. The pandemic that has transcribed the course of business on the global market as rapid economic growth continues is considered to be a shift of political structure and deconstructs the empire's middle class. So this is leaving the majority of society to form a new peasantry class that continues to fall a veil to disease, and the new era of modernity begins. This shift prioritizes texts from scientific discovery of medicine to replace the superstitions of the time, Christian references and influence in the development of art, culture, and leisure practices that are used by the newly literate class to explain the deaths in the world around them. The trading empires continue their participation of the expansion of the port system in the western and eastern colonial front. As this area of the world and the establishment of an all-sea port system continues. So they also provided for the artists to depict exotic costumes, architecture, and luxury goods, hallmarks of the Enlightenment movement style, the distribution of the feudal government system of the radicals, formerly rich landowners, part of the aristocratic upper middle class, led to other revolutions due in large part to the changes of the economy. So these economic philosophies and other revolutions due in large part to the changes of the economic philosophies and the redistribution of wealth results in the revolution from old order and the toppling of the monarchical order and the new system of governance, which is much more efficient feudal system of governance, as they take arms against the monarchical hand in the control of the agricultural countryside. In large part, the revolution, while the introduction of heavy machinery to accelerate production in the agricultural system, new technologies of the Industrial Revolution replaced much of the radicals and peasantry class of the French countryside. The capitalistic system of economy and its philosophies that take place in England and partially in France, Russia does not, so Russia does not experience an overthrow of the government, a political shift for nearly 2 centuries, in which the government had to intervene in order to speed the system as the capitalistic transformations that take place in Europe and Germany, while there's no evidence of the real industrialization states that drastically differ within the two paths of the societies ensue. These two totalitarian states prove that it does not transform these societies into equals, but does not transform these societies equally despite the evolution of the Enlightened and the educational reformation after the rebirth of the world market. So the Civil War created a very different government system as the development of the bourgeoisie and the business class of the French take arms against the free market system that has taken control of the Western European territories and interior Asia. The commercial revolutions that occur in the trading empire began to result in rapid transportation of commerce in the East Asian coasts and the establishment of China as a world superpower, as the merchants continue to be looked down upon from the aristocratic land-owning elites from Southeast Asia and harvest strains of rice, a hybrid agriculture that spurred enough food to feed thousands of people. I don't know that I said that before, but you do understand when you're dealing with a lot of poor populations that are now contracting an ailment, a disease, this pathogen can be maybe too much for their immune system, so having enough crop readily available is kind of imperative. Otherwise, it's outcome, the consequence might not be what you want in a society that is arguing being liberal, capitalistic, and modernized, right? So you want to have lots of examples of your culturalization in societies restructuring it, so you would need a lot of people, so that would not be good. But what I'm getting at is that was vital. So these people, they start to create potential, and create the potential for a stronger, which also created the potential for a stronger market to rival Europe for control of the free market. So textiles, metal are easily employed across the oceanic system of trade, long distance trade with Japan and the Indian and eastern coast of Africa, as the commercial power of China suggests that the industrialization of goods and services proves to be the most efficient method of globalization and the establishment of rapid economic growth in the world market. So the feudal obligations of the French countryside lived as the subjects of the dynasty, and they began to overthrow the dynastic rule to preserve the traditional societies and fundamental change of capitalism and the rights of private property guarantees a member of society that their property will not be taken away without providing an explanatory mechanism for occasions when those interpretations differ from what an individual's prior beliefs and political leanings would otherwise predict. So, firstly, through the Means period of rule, many architectural feats were developed, including the brutalist style of modern architecture, commonly used as a trademark stylistic feature of the time, devastating the church's bureaucracy and the threat of these pandemics. Once endemic, the church's bureaucracy, the threat of these pandemics, once endemic disease that had at this point in time rapidly developed in mutated strains of multiple pandemics, wiping out much of the population, and the function of these diseases and the function of disease in the ancient world as seen by the Chinese to devastate these empires, and were the major concentrations were to spread from China to the Roman world. This transportation through the Mediterranean, as these two, from China to the Roman world, transportation through the Mediterranean as these totalitarian states continue to establish trade. These depictions were not only commissioned in areas that followed, but rivaled the English church. Kind of a tongue twister, but I think you understand. So these depictions, again, were not only commissioned in the area that followed, but rivaled the English church. The Western invasion began in numbers and represented no immediate threat to the greatest imperial system on the face of the world, China, and remained the largest economic in the world well into the 18th century. So Europeans were having an increased impact on China's history and its impact on the global economic platform. As previously mentioned, in the tributary system was often no more than a thin cover for trade, in that foreign merchants, especially the Muslim traders who were ubiquitous among the Central Asia caravan routes, that the southern sea lanes often posed as envoys in order to engage in trade. Most Chinese traditionalists consider this practice an abuse of Roman cultural practices. All the same, it is to stretching the imagination too far to see a rough correspondence between the mechanical universe of the 17th century philosophers and the bourgeoisie desire for rational, predictable orders. The Mughal Empire makes it possible for the transportation of precious goods across long distances, with the transportation of disease, which presents a welcoming environment for these diseases, actually, and a power vacuum in the Mediterranean, because the decline of states like Venice and Genoa, undermining the strengths of the Christian church, and had a huge impact basically belief systems across the country to embrace, and by embracing the idea that the death being now inevitable, death now all around us, is the loss of faith. This concept is further explained in art through thematic Buddhist Buddha Shakyamuni from Chola period, about, again, 12th century. I think I've already mentioned this. Nagapatanyama, a southern port city in the southern coast of India, and is considered to be this day a mecca for specific sites of agricultural ruins, but a housing space for the artifacts of the time not accessible from any other city based on the religious sacredly these relics basically contained whereas the explicitly and the dignity that the Mongols and the Mughal Empire attempts to preserve within the confines of its methods of business and the methods of business relations throughout China, England, Europe, France, and the world market. So these two totalitarian states and the network of capitalist societies that are participating in the trading empires experience cultural exchange of religious importance. For example, Buddha an interest in nature, shows an interest in nature in an attempt to open up the western port city of modern-day Lebanon in order to take control of the strategically pivotal of travel on the Mediterranean against Portugal, Italy, and Spain. So the vision of a kingdom of man upon earth. And this is kingdom of man. I mean, you can direct quote this. It's something you can look into. And this isn't me speaking. It's just a coin term, but upon earth. So see how it's like kind of a sensitive thing to mention, but it's something I'm going to mention because, again, it's part of the text and it's important to note that this was taking place during this revival. So much of Bacon's imagery was borrowed from geographical discoveries. He aspired to be the Columbus of new intellectual world, to sail through the pillars of Hercules, the symbol of old knowledge, into the Atlantic Ocean in search of new and more useful knowledge. Like I said, the modern age of science continues, and it is established. So, however, though, it's established, but however, the pre-modern societies failed to detect the coincidence of the scientific revolution with the commercial prosperity and the rise of the middle class. So the masculinity of the empire, rapid economic growth, exquisite pottery, the invention of the printing that allowed for mass production of mythological books, and the literate rural class outside the rural maritime port cities, and tried to stop it when they detected it, and were commissioned through the times as devices that are iconic during the time of the pandemic, while the lives of the entire population were infected with the Black Death. So merchants from urban ports maintained the importance of these artisan depictions of these theatrics through carved materials, which were reflected in history by the Mongols of China, whose status of Buddha Yamani, seated in meditation, this Daya Namudra from the Chola period, again from the 12th century, Nagapatanam Tamil Nadu, India, carved from granite, and the third monumental Buddha comes from the coastal town of Nagapatinam in southern India, were seen as rare flourishing sites for Buddhism in the 12th century. So globalization, the economic integration equating to capitalistic systems of governance in which money transference develops the economic system of governance to integrate international financial systems of distribution amongst the commerce and the mercantile members of the global playing field, never though of before. So, however, to integrate economics and technology transferences all over the world, instantaneous communications through the modernization of societies that cause disruptions despite being positive or negative, while the cultural exchange frantically paced with the globalization that occurred in such rapid speed. First major eras of these communications and exchanges caused an onset of endemics and rapid development of pandemics as the emergence on the world stage through commerce continues. So first in Portugal, the Portuguese are the first to initiate on the capitalistic economic exchange, and to the Americas and other parts of the world. Gunpowder may indeed have been a factor, although it is unlikely that an importance lay in blowing off feudal walls of China, which enjoyed such international peace that is aristocratically lineaged and did not engage in castle building or architectural style rather than in a brutalist building of the sort typical in Europe. This China did not have many feudal fortifications to blow up the wall of China, designed to keep steep nomadics from invading China. However, the exchange of the monopolized gunpowder creates, on behalf of France, the value necessary of the commodity to pursue culture and mercantile exchange in part of the world never previously exposed to disease. The onset of the bubonic plague and the transmission of the disease from rats and fleas that traveled along the merchants of the upper middle class began to infect the weak immune system of the nomadic and sedimentary populations, and mutated strands of the disease developed, infecting those not wiped out during the first wave of the endemic. The endemic continues to develop in the nomadic enemies to the north. Soon the Song dynasty ultimately falls to the Mongols, most horribly forced to emerge from Eurasian empires and reside within their hosts as the immune systems of their surviving populations continue with their commerce practices in Eurasia, other colonial neighbors of eastern coast of Africa, and into Western Europe through the carriers that previously died before reaching the next seaport for commerce. So that was, that in a nutshell is basically the historical endemic or pandemic tagline. It really could be so that it happened that many times that through the carriers that previously were on board on ship traveling to the next port, they would die. That was like what typically happens before they reached the port in which they were going to conduct their business. So, it is that happened more times than not, and it happened more times than any other thing that affected this transition into modernity, more so than pirates, more so than people getting lost or displaced, more so than people running out of money, running out of maybe committing a crime and getting run off. I'm not sure what other conditions you could come up with, but that happened more times in history than any other thing to note when talking about endemics. The carriers would die before reaching the next seaport to conduct business. So the emphasis on religion and the spread of Christianity created war with Mexico, as the concept of manifest destiny in large part continues to be combated by the spread of disease. The large commercial empire's expansion from the American territories creates an established economic educational reform to transform the economy and defy the social structure of consumer paradise in the world's vision for capitalistic world economy. So this idea of good versus evil, the illusion is a theme within the anti-globalization movement that takes place in the late 80s. Many have not participated in the free market economy. However, the NAFTA political leaders see that this is a major threat to what will result in losing major political affluence. This takes place in Bolivia, Venezuela, Chile, and Chile. During the exchange, the scare of the third wave of the pandemic disease. Right, so this is now taken on a third wave, and it emerges and it is concentrated within the confines of the free trade areas of textile and world markets that are being controlled by corporate investments, and create the system of educational reforms with an initiative with initiatives to feed the poor and to establish social security for the most vulnerable and susceptible populations of the world. So, as previously discussed, the Song dynasty is marked by a threat from the neighboring lineage groups, with Renaissance approach to expansion and trade, which was expressed in arts and that mimics the Romans. Their practice to attack and rally members from the imperial empire to defend the interests of the nomadic tribesmen and the exquisite horsemanship, decentralized competitive societies, and aim to defend the lineage groups of China. The aristocratic lineage began to rival the state and the needs of the agricultural peasants, rationalizing the use of compasses and other technologies to cross to the West European ports, to the long-established ports of East Africa and Asia, to find an all-sea route to Western Europe and undergo the Renaissance or Reformation. The application of what China possessed through the use of the technologies previously mentioned and are to include gunpowder and the invention of steamboats for rapid means of mobility and transportation through the Pacific and into the Americas. In our reading, as previously discussed, essentially, Needmans begins to ask what was wrong with China. And we are able to infer that actually there was nothing wrong with China. China is fundamentally changed by these inventions. Without comparing China to Europe, the technology and commercial changes that accumulate during the Song dynasty, historians are beginning to use the terms revolution, which is date range 960 to 1279, comparatively to England, which is experiencing an industrial revolution basically through the 18th and 19th century. So in China, the Tang dynasty that has favored the elite aristocratic and the practices of the Song dynasty due to the accessibility of gunpowder, practice and aggressive primate acquisitions, which occurred without the Chinese aristocrats. So, as previously mentioned, accessibility to gunpowder may indeed have been a factor, although it is unlikely that it is important to lay down in using it to blow up feudal walls, so that China architecturally was not basically influenced really by Europe. So China did not have many feudal fortifications to blow up. The only wall of significance, the Great Wall of China, designed to keep the steppe nomads from invading China. Gunpowder starts to be processed and contextually processed and coded and interpreted in art and other realms, or other conceptualized itself as basically to be something used for damages. Its influence as a factor to monopolize the terrible new empire's power. So this begins to rival with their nomadic enemies to north, and soon the Song dynasty ultimately fell to the Mongols most formidably, which forced an imperial power to emerge from the Eurasian steppe. The shift prioritizing texts from scientific discoveries of medicine again to replace the superstitions of the time. Christians' references and influence in the development of the art, the culture, the leisure practices that are used by the newly literate class to explain the deaths and the world around them. The trading empires continue their participation with the expansion of the port system in the West and the Eastern colonial front. So as their area of the world and the establishment of an all seaport system, the world, the masculinity of the empire, rapid economic growth, and the exquisite porcelain and the investment of printing that allowed for mass production of mythological books as well. The establishment of this literate ruler class outside the rural maritime port city. Again, the establishment of the literate rural class outside the rural maritime port cities. We kind of explained that earlier. So these depictions were not only commissioned in areas that followed, but rivaled the English church. So the Western invasion began in numbers and repressed no immediate threats to the greatest imperial system on the face of the world, China, and remained the largest economy in the world well into the 18th century. Europeans were having the increased impact on China's history. So again, Europeans were having an increased impact on China's history and its impact on the global economic platform. So what some of the principal features of this British rule in India look like, which is concurrently taking place, the enlightened and the scholarly guilds begin to revolt against the Church of England for the political control, for a chance to feed the malnourished population that grows more susceptible to the pandemic. So once again, the scholarly guilds begin to revolt against the Church of England for political control of a chance to feed the malnourished population that grows more susceptible to the pandemic, and their financial control of the economy that they have established through cultural exchange. The Church of England has begun to loan and finance much of the world economy, collecting the agricultural portions of peasantry countryside to establish an apprenticeship system of mercantile within the peasantry class. Master craftsmen would train the peasantry class in the specialized skills used to modernize the commodities, and they used to establish their trading empires. These heavily machinery would maim and sever much of the peasantry class and their trading empires, and these heavy machineries would maim and sever them. This population was unable to interact with the new technologies. Their practices of artisanal goods continues basically in the creating of a perfect candlestick, and that is, like we mentioned, you're not letting everybody make the entire candle. They basically either put the wick in, or they just add wax, but they don't participate in all of the process. So this establishes a feudal system. The system of governance allows for positions within the nobility and removes the standing militia that has majority been taken out of the first wave of the endemic. So most of them have died now because of the endemic. And as previously discussed, Geneva and Sicily most iconically claimed stakes at the Mediterranean, overpassing Madrid and Barcelona due in large part to the climate and the church's establishment of the rule. The mining of silver in these areas turns Italy into a superpower and a controlling force in the world market as the capitalist economic growth proceeds into the previously mentioned areas of Italy. And Enlightenment artists begin to establish their importance by historians during the 1500s, and in history of the pandemic studies during the transference of period and gestation of mutant strands, and this emergence after the Ebola, the Black Death, the strands that are with mutations to adapt to the immune systems of those not wiped out by the first wave of the disease. Early strands of E. coli, as previously mentioned, the development of the disease begins to mobilize the strands and the indigenous population's immune systems that have built a resistance within their hosts. However, these merchants continue to infect by what is now the bubonic plague that has in fact the world market of continued system of commerce that includes great works of art, weaponry, pottery, and the three most important spices, silver, and sugar, as in the third wave of transmission within the urbanized peasantry class of mercantile trade establishes the trading empires established capitalistic importance of sectors within the governance system that is despondent and reiterated later by the Chicago Boys. So during the cultural exchange within China that establishes them as a world superpower centuries ago and remains so to this day, as the holistic beliefs of the pursuit of illusionary pleasures and dubious ambitions enlightened, and ultimately the rebuilding of the society and its economy began to depend heavily on foreign investment, salvation would come from a progressive disengagement from the real world. So leading to their pivotal role in the world economy, and they begin to re-examine the social and economic political changes during the time. Their role in the world market experiences rapid economic growth, and the movement of enlightenment begins to influence new forms of work due in large part to the origins of modern science. So the solution to the pandemics that had overtaken and wiped many seaside ports and agricultural areas is established in the Western Europe, Eurasia, and other colonial neighbors with the use of modern science, which is used to explain the reality of the world around them, living and dead, which remains evident in works found from the 15th to 16th century. So during the rebirth of society in the early 15th century, which marks the Second Renaissance, the pandemic that has transcribed the course of business in the global market as the rapid economic growth continues is considered to be a shift of political structure, right? So this destructs somehow the empire's middle class, believe it or not, leaving the majority of society to form a new peasantry class that continues to fall a veil to disease, and the new era of modernity begins. So this shift prioritizes text from the scientific discovery of medicine to replace the superstitions of time, Christian references and influence in the development of art and culture and leisure practices that are used by the newly literate class to explain the deaths in the world around them. The trading empires continue their participation with the expansion of the port system in the western and eastern colonial front as this area of the world is established of an all-sea port system. The masculinity of the empire, rapid growth, economic growth, exquisite porcelain and invention of printing that allows for mass production of mythological books and established the literate rural class outside of the rural maritime port cities. These depictions were not only commissioned in areas that followed but rivaled the English church. So Western invasions began in numbers and represented no immediate threat. So the greatest imperial system on the face of the world, China, and this remained the largest economy in the world, the largest economy in the world. And into the 18th century, Europeans were having the increased impact on China's history and its impact on the global economic platform. As previously mentioned, the tributary system was often no more than a thin cover for a trade in the caravan routes that the southern seas lanes often posed as envoys in order to engage in trade. Most Chinese traditional considered this practice to be an abuse of Roman cultural practices and tried to stop it when they detected it, and were commissioned through this time as devices that were iconic during the time of pandemics. While the lives of the entire populations were infected with the Black Death, merchants from the urban port maintained the importance of these aristocratic depictions of theatrics through carved materials, which were reflected in history by the Mongols of China, those whose statues of Buddha Shakyamuni seated in meditation Dhyana Murada from Shola period around about 12th century. Nagapattinam, Tamil Nadu, India, carved from granite. The third monumental Buddha comes from the coastal town of Nagapattinam in southern India. Were seen as very flourishing sites for Buddhism in the 12th century. So basically, this reiterates that establishment of what it was and how it remained to be for centuries to come, right? So the globalization, this economic integration that equated to capitalistic systems of governance in which money transference developed the economic system of governance to integrate international financial systems of distribution amongst the commerce and the mercantile members of the global playing field. Never though before, however, to integrate economies and technology transferences all around the world instantaneously, communicating this medium of communication through the modernization of societies causes disruption. So despite being positive or negative, while these cultural exchanges are frantically placed and the globalization occurs at such a rapid speed, first major areas of these communications and these exchanges cause the onset of endemics, essentially. So the rapid development of pandemics as they emerge on the world stage through commerce also take place first in Portugal. The Portuguese are the first to initiate on the capitalistic economic exchange and on the Americas and other parts of the world. Gunpowder, I know, basically this is all kind of like a repeat, but I think what it's leading to is this is like the voice, the verbal receipt you want to give in context to this. So it is like the Portuguese are the first to initiate on the capitalistic economic exchange in the Americas, and the Portuguese are the first to initiate this capitalistic economic exchange to the Americas and other parts of the world. So gunpowder may indeed have been like the factor that is unlikely to have had its importance lay in blowing out feudal walls of China, because it enjoyed such an international peace that it's aristocratically lineage, because it did not engage in castle building basically or architectural design, rather in a brutalistic building of the sort of typical in Europe. Thus, China did not have many feudal fortifications to blow up, so the Wall of China, designed to keep steep nomadics from invading China, did exist. But however, this exchange of monopolized gunpowder created the value necessary of commodity to pursue cultural and mercantile exchange in parts of the world never previously exposed to disease. So they were carriers, but they had gunpowder. So I think a lot of people got wind with the exchange of, I wanted to say that they had started sending messages to each other. So if they were able to do that, they probably got concrete evidence, or they knew that they were transmitters or carriers, but they still wanted the gunpowder because it was them or France. So this onset of the bubonic plague and the transmission of the disease from rats and fleas that traveled along with the merchants of the upper middle class began to infect the weak immune system of the nomadic and sedimentary populations, and mutated strands of the disease developed, infecting those not wiped out during the first wave of the endemic. The endemic continued to develop in the nomadic enemies to the north. Soon the Song dynasty ultimately fell to the Mongols, most formidably forced to emerge from the Eurasian empires and reside within their hosts as the immune systems of the surviving population continues with their commerce practices in Eurasia. The colonial neighbors of the eastern coast of Africa and into Western Europe through the carriers that previously died before reaching the next seaport for commerce. So the Soviets will investigate the world economy that is based on the principles of capitalism, and in order to produce the most profit and the best possible goods while wanting to use cheap raw materials that the Eurasian and Indian seaport system established by the peasantry caste system, which begins to upheaval. The King of France is murdered, the monarchical rule is overthrown, and those who together under the modern state template that led to the French Revolution, with this reign of the conflicts play out the battle royale and a war with the aristocratic and the parliament's courts, conflict with the judicial legislation that is vetoed under his rule. Louis, I want to say it's like XXIV, not XIV. Okay, well, dynasties within the Chinese empires are overthrown and excluded from the tributary systems of port system mercantile, and the Merchants Guild establishes a just peace, which poses a serious question for the development of these factors that also provide the artisan with a decent living wage for males and ensures the price of the goods would not be gouged. So their capitalistic beliefs that have existed for centuries while under attack by warrior states begins to fray because this mass production of sugar and the performance of quality checks and this capitalistic beliefs that have existed for centuries while under these artisans under these artisans begin to do away with the training programs for the apprentice shops, for the artisan apprentice shops. So the mass complete and illustrate. So they begin to compete and illustrate their competence on how to perform the task with singular focus, performing just one step in the candle making process. These specialized tasks such as pouring wax, pouring metal are utilized in Paris, the capital city of the wage labor, for much less money, and this is taking place in Paris, and simultaneously in other cities like England, which begins to undermine the marketplace in Paris, and simultaneously other cities like England and their rural peasantry class have incorporated and have been forced to participate in the market. The disconnected classes are vastly dependent on cheap goods and services, and they begin to squeeze out more from the large landowners, and peasantry classes begin to rebel and sweep the landowners away. The working male class begins to raise concern for rises from the male dominance within the small population of aristocratic in their destruction of the upper middle class, which is now in large part unhappy with the state, in particular as they continue in their attempt to centralize the power of the state, and the working class is also concerned with the integration of the guild system and the rising cost of food prices, market costs, and the peasantry beings to see their traditional lifestyles being compromised by increasing the pressure to fail. The working male, Louis XIV fails to create a content class under the centralized rule efficient tax system that not only affects the working male by the socially vulnerable as previously discussed. This efficient tax system is created as a result for attempting to reestablish the nuclear family jobs. Male dominance with the European clutch enforces women in every aspect of the culture. Basically, they are allowed now to become landowners. Land owning and monopolizing the rural outskirts and every aspect of the nation's state governance system, development, for educational reforms, political systems of nobility. It was not an option for many, but not at all for women. So, this is talking about the male dominance to basically say that that's the change, right? So lastly, capitalism takes over and everyone is left to fend for themselves in order to outlive the pandemics. They have been unable to avail, and all of these Types of revolutions take place. Trading empires wage labor establish or help establish so the world in which they are soon put to a test of strategy, because the World War II and the Great Depression's emergencies in less than a decade of these political powers, basically power struggles of India and European submission to the English and Russian and Japanese feudal systems, aiding in women's opportunity for some sort of political order within the global trading market. And this political revival establishes the mercantile class of governance, as a previously mentioned, the tributary system, which was often no more than a thin veil for trade in the foreign merchants, especially with the Muslim traders who were ambiguous amongst the Central Asia caravan routes that the southern sea lanes often pose as envoys in order to engage in trade that takes over the world economic market as the world market, as the capitalists establish a free for all system cultural exchange within the world market, and of all seaport systems of trade among the urban elites, and begin to reintegrate the trade relations with the Moguls of Eurasia in a push to open the western border for trade. So French enforce through their exclusivity of gunpowder and access to textiles and ready-made garments as resources to fight off the English Parliament, and their territorial confounds begin to dispute amongst the agricultural peasantry class that would certainly cause a collapse of the English system of governance. Ottoman Empire struggled to maintain order in the Western Hemisphere. A number of intellectuals in empire embrace so this national secularism within the Ottoman Empire to preserve it as a modern nation state based on the Western government, and this would collapse after 1918. This political secular national movement, which is Islamic, with its influence within the nation state to be secular nationalists versus a Saudi monarchy, Iranian nationalizing the oil industry to provide a reimbursement among the participants of the free market world economy, begin an agreement among secular nationalists in order to preserve a modern state and include Japan's industrial control of the playing field. The crisis industry owned by the British began to experience conflicts from the cultural exchange in the world stage through the language barrier. So this global superpower, the United States, participates in place of the Chinese on the world stage, strategically employing an alliance, again undermining military forces that have harsh relations based in large part to the contradictory theologies now densely populating the Mediterranean ports of Lebanon, Egypt, and English territories. They began to establish an educational reform and westernized approach to medicine. The exhausted authoritarian system of governance from the French continues to take inventory. A clash of clash of cultures established relations with the Sudan, Sunni, and turn the oil industries over to the push for Western modernization with these large-scale investments in the arts and the cultural developments, while the agricultural field suffers growing unrest, in part for Iran because of modernization, while the cleansing of the port continues because of the displacement and the development of textiles in Iran, and the threats to the traditional marketplace of the cultural influence and principal features of closing markets and traditional marketplaces, and the medical conflicts similar to open political systems, conservative views of their modernization of consumer culture and the modernization of the Middle East, the workforce of women to be created despite the traditional nuclear family, and the preservation of stay-at-home characterization of a radical system of organization amongst the caste system of modern-day Iran. During this period of consumer paradise, industrialization of modern economy, creates economic disparity and conflicts on the world market, which are on the rise. So these points were made in modern day galleries as a political protest for women's equal rights in today's American society, which was fundamentally comprised by the Sultan ruler of having to apply Islamic law under free trade in areas that the consumer paradise spreads to Latin America and Japan. Start to realize that the consumer dream is made available. The Great Recession lingers into 2010 and 2011. The definition of family through the purchase of new identity, with rapid economic growth being comprised in undermining the capitalistic mentality, the world state, which gives rise to the Indian population of mercantile guilds that begin to prosper under the monarchical rule with the emergence of the free trade agreements that despond as political practices that establish world order on the free trade market, despite ill temperaments that begin to ensue amongst the societies excluded from the trade agreements. So I think that the last thing I'm going to cover is here, and as previously discussed, the Song Dynasty is marked by a threat from its neighboring lineage groups and Renaissance. So it's like this thing I'm going to get into next time. The Indian subcontinent, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. In addition, there is also a treatment of Islam that does not lend itself to the geographic categorizing used in the other five cases. So organizing in the Arabian Peninsula, Islam soon spreads across North Africa into Europe, across the Indian subcontinent and Central Asia, and even into the Indonesian archipelago. I'm so sorry, I'm butchering that completely, and I can't even hear the word in my head, so I'm just gonna keep going. That technical difference hardly would allow its exclusion from its group, given the enormous impact of the Islamic faith, both then and now. So focus to be kind of like where we definitely end. Broad outages of societies, how they regulate themselves to share the material world around them, their forms of government, however functioned, their economic systems and their value systems, which they professed. So that's like a really fancy way of saying their culturalization. So it doesn't, I guess I was maybe getting hung up on the fact that it is giving you like an idea of what directions people were traveling to see each other and which directions they were going. And yes, we understand like people migrating to the ports and being part of that culture, but the focus would then be to reiterate what the book is wanting you to take away. It would be that there's a broad outages of societies, how they regulate themselves to share the materials, this material world around them, their forms of government, however functioned, their economic systems and their value systems, which would be what they professed, and that is how you would go down a checklist to see the modernization, the upheaval before that, and maybe what it looked like before that took place. So just what the focus and the bar for the book is, because I know there's a lot of ways to interpret the material and go about talking about it, but that is what this book had for me, and I'm hoping maybe somebody reads it and tells me if they or something, but that is also I'm going to turn this off now.